Several years after moving to Fort Collins, I decided that one way I could participate in communal life here would be to become involved in our homeowners association. I fear that some of you have also suffered that fate. I had done so in another setting and found it to be a more or less agreeable experience. For a variety of reasons, the best option was to become part of the Architectural Control Committee. The name suggests the committee has to do primarily with overseeing changes to the exterior of houses, for example, approving paint colors or the placement of solar systems on a roof. However, the committee also had responsibility for the common areas, which included matters such as landscape design, mowing, sprinkler systems, tree care, and so forth. I've served on that committee now for almost a decade, having worked with various committee chairs. Some were better than others, but most did a decent job of helping the committee do its work. Not so the current chair, whom I'll call John. In a typical meeting, we'll begin to work through an agenda. But it's not long before John starts complaining. Complaining about the mowing, whether the grass is being cut too short or too high. Complaining about the sprinkler system running too much or individual sprinkler heads that aren't working. Complaining about the presence of weeds in turf or in xeriscaped areas. Complaining about the city not fertilizing the trees that it had planted in the areas between the sidewalks and the streets. Complaining about the arborists for not spraying enough for insects or trimming branches appropriately or removing dead trees. Complaining about past committee chairs for not having kept appropriate records of their work. And complaining about other members on the Homeowners Association board for not caring more about the work of his committee. With such a roster of negative language, it's not surprising that other members of the committee began to chime in with their own complaints, some of which had absolutely nothing to do with the work of the committee. There were so many such asides in those committee meetings that the committee was often unable to complete the work it needed to do. John complained, committee members complained, and the committee members ended up complaining about John. The committee had created a culture of complaint. And somewhat ironically, I'm complaining about it this morning. And I really do not live a life of complaint. I'm reminded of that experience when I read Numbers chapter 11, which you just heard. A story that involves lots of complaining. It belongs to a series of narratives about the Israelites in the wilderness. The backstory is this. Israel had been enslaved in Egypt, but their God had liberated them. Then their God had defeated the Egyptians in action many of us have seen depicted in Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments. Walls of water have crashed down on the Egyptians and their chariots, thereby allowing the Israelites to escape on dry land. And the people then began their trek to the Promised Land. But it was a journey through an inhospitable and dangerous wilderness. It was the sort of desert that one can now see in pictures of the southern Sinai. During their 40 years in the wilderness, the people complained bitterly to their leader Moses and to God. They complained about not having water. They complained about not having bread. And they complained about having to eat the miraculous food God had provided for them, manna. And now in our text, they complain about not having the wonderful vegetables and fruit that they enjoyed in Egypt, and about not having fish and meat to eat. They craved the food they ate in Egypt. They referred explicitly to missing cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. When I read this narrative, I can just imagine what God might have said to this people. Now, I don't often try to play God, especially because I no longer have teenagers at home. But this is the tone, I think, I imagine God having used. I freed you from a life of enslavement. I brought you out of Egypt. I rescued you from Pharaoh's army. And you complain about not having melons and cucumbers? Give me a break. End of God. So it's not surprising the narrator reports that God gets angry when he hears the people complaining. One should probably say that God is complaining. And that's not all. Moses gets angry and starts to complain. And he complains to God about several things. He points out that God has given him too big a job to do. Moses didn't ask for it. God had told him to act as a mother to this young child, Israel, even though Moses didn't want that kind of responsibility. And now, where is Moses supposed to get meat that his children are demanding? God has quite simply been treating Moses badly. Everybody is complaining. The people, God, Moses. It's just like my architectural control committee. The Israelite camp had developed a culture of complaining. But now we need to dig into the story and look at the complaints. To be sure, a culture of complaint had developed. But were any of the complaints legitimate? To use my homeowners association analogy, was too much water being used? Was the grass ever cut too short? The Israelite complaints don't seem credible, but those of Moses do. So in some measure, this narrative presents contrasting complaints. Moses and his brother Aaron have had virtually no help while leading the people out of Egypt and through the wilderness. So during the episode of complaint that we heard this morning, God tells Moses to gather 70 elders of the people who will then be empowered to help Moses govern his community. The story is clear. Complaining is okay if the circumstances warrant it. But complaint without good justification lies at the heart of this narrative. The story's conclusion makes this ever so clear. God tells the people that he will provide meat for them. He will give it to them for a whole month, day after day. And I quote, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you. You want meat, you're going to get meat. So what does this mean for us? How do you or I complain? I can imagine a happy face, or an angry face, or a sad face. But a complaining face, I can't see it without an open mouth. It's hard to complain without saying something. To complain is to speak certain kinds of critical words and with a certain negative or accusatory tone. You can be happy or you can be sad without saying anything. Not so complaining. So if we wanted to move beyond living in a culture of complaint, what could we do? One answer comes from the psalm that you heard read this morning. Let the words of my mouth be acceptable to you, O Lord. Let the words of my mouth be acceptable to you, O Lord. Many of us have heard those words just before a sermon begins, when a minister offers a brief prayer before beginning to preach. Our recent associate Jake Joseph did this on a regular basis, as do many other ministers. But speaking acceptable words is not something that only ministers do or want to do. One may hope that when any of us talk, we too would want to say acceptable things. If we think about what we say, especially when we complain, we are probably often saying things that are not acceptable. Not acceptable to God, not acceptable to others, and probably not even acceptable to ourselves. How many times have I thought, I wish I hadn't said that. I wish I hadn't complained to or about someone and what he or she had said or done. If I had a filter installed in my mouth that limited what I said would be acceptable to God, I would have been and be a lot better off. While thinking about the notions of complaint and acceptable words, I recalled an episode here at Plymouth. It was during the pandemic. Sarah and I hadn't been here in person for a while. And when we entered the fellowship hall, a member came up and said, "We haven't seen you for a while." It was said in a tone that made me feel like I had to justify both my absence and my presence there that morning. I've never forgotten it. Her greeting was really one of complaint rather than affirmation. How different it would have been to hear her say, "It's great to see you today." That sounds more like words that would be acceptable. Dobby Gibson, a contemporary author, echoed this sentiment in a recent poem, one line of which reads, and I will repeat it, "If only what we need to say to one another would land so softly on our tongues we could taste it. If only what we need to say to one another would land so softly on our tongues we could taste it." I think he means that if we taste something bitter or complaining on our tongue, we would be better off not speaking that word. Those are the bitter words that are not likely to be acceptable to God. The lectionary readings today ask us to consider whether we want to live in a culture of complaint or a culture of affirmation. If we choose a culture of affirmation, each time we speak, even just brief words to one another here or elsewhere, we can contemplate that phrase from the Psalms, "Let the words of my mouth be acceptable to you, O God." If they are, the chances are good they will be acceptable to others as well. Amen.